I have a story for you that really will make your skin crawl. It's a story about what happened to me a couple of years ago when a problematic employee started acting up. I was working at McDonald's at the time. I was a manager for some years now, and I knew how to do my job extremely well. This wasn't a career that I had dreamed of since I was a kid, but following certain circumstances that went on in my life throughout the years, I ended up here. I started as a cashier and worked my way up. I knew that the customer was always right, and I strongly believed that more important than the food was the attitude towards the people who come and eat here. And as a manager, I expected nothing less from my employees. I would always talk to them, and I would even train them. My goal was to prepare every single employee for those bad customers that would be rude to them. One day, I received a resume. It was from a woman who was pretty old to work at McDonald's. She was 59, but I found that her resume was interesting. She was a former manager herself, but due to different problems at the workplace and the economy, she ended up jobless. I decided to give her a chance and called her in for a second interview. Everything went well. She was nice, smart, and as I could tell, she was really eager to learn something new. I just had a feeling that she would be a hard worker and would not slack off like many of the other employees do. I gave her a chance, and the next day she came in for work, early I might add. I was already there because I would always arrive ahead of time, but I was surprised when I saw her 2 hours early. Because we had some time to spare, I trained her and managed to give some insights about what was going on there. She seemed to be picking it up really well. I also insisted on the fact that she may encounter some rude customers, and I explained what she needed to do if that happens. The woman named Mary was a delight. She was doing everything right, but something happened after about 2 months. We started to get complaints about a certain employee. We didn't receive any before, and as I began reading the written complaints from the suggestion box, I could see that absolutely all of them were about Mary. I couldn't believe it. She was so nice and helpful. I wondered what could have happened. But as I continued to read on, I could see that all of the complaints were the same. The woman was being rude to any customer who didn't eat their entire meal. One person also wrote that they left a couple of fries on the tray, and when Mary saw them, she lost it. Mary started to yell at the person, demanded that he would eat what was left. She then started saying that the person was skinny and looked sick. The majority of the complaints were along these lines. The person left food on the tray, and as he wanted to leave, Mary would come right over and yell at the person, calling him names, sometimes even picking the food up and trying to shove it into their mouths. It was something that I never had to deal with before. I tried to talk to her, but when I did, she explained that it's a shame for people to waste food. She wondered why would they buy it if they didn't want to finish all of it. I talked to her and explained that it is none of her business what the person does, as long as they pay for their food. At that moment, Mary got angry and started yelling at me, telling me that I don't understand and that I'm as small-minded as all the people who come to McDonald's and only eat half of what they ordered. I tried not to get angry, but her behavior was unacceptable. I told her that I would give her one last chance to change her behavior or she would be out of there. Mary said, "Fine," and got up before heading towards the door of my office, slamming it behind her. But to my surprise, the next day, she was even worse, as I saw her being rude to the customers with my own eyes. One girl ordered a Big Mac, and she only took one bite of it. She then stood up to leave, but Mary shouted at her from across the room. It was so embarrassing. So at that moment, I took her into my office and had no choice but to fire her. She then smiled at me, and instead of being angry, she said the same, "Fine," but in a calmer tone of voice. For the next few days, everything went well at the workplace. There were no complaints, and people relaxed, knowing that the crazy woman was no longer working there. It was hard to do, but I had to get rid of her. Sometimes, as a manager, you have to make tough decisions. One night, as I was preparing to go to bed and my wife was on a work trip, I decided to go into the kitchen and have a glass of milk. I opened the fridge, grabbed my milk, and as I turned around, I thought I heard the sound of a door creaking. I said, "Hello?" thinking that my wife came home a couple of hours earlier, but with no response. I checked everything, and I got used to the idea that I must have misheard the noise. Anyway, I went back to bed and fell asleep in no time, thanks to the milk. I don't know for how long I was asleep, but I woke up at around 2 a.m. all of a sudden, and I couldn't move my hands and my legs. I thought it was sleep paralysis, but when I had a look, I saw that I was tied up. I screamed, but no one answered. After a couple of minutes of me trying to escape, Mary came in my bedroom. I was freaked out and asked her what is going on, but instead of answering me, she came closer, and I could see that she had some food in her hands. In her right hand, she had a McDouble, and in her left hand, she had fries. She starts shoving the food in my mouth, force-feeding me. The food didn't stop. Even when I was choking, she stuffed fries down my throat. Not long, and I started to tear up. It was a horrible experience, and I thought I was going to suffocate at any moment. Mary kept smiling, and without saying a word, she continued to feed me. I even threw up a couple of times, but she said that it was all right. She has more food. The woman had a giant bag from McDonald's next to my bed, enough to feed 20 people. I begged her to stop each time I had my mouth without food in it, but she continued. I peed myself as I was crying and throwing up at the same time. I thought I was going to die and that one piece of food will get stuck in my throat. I was there in a puddle of my own urine and vomit, totally helpless. At around 5 a.m., I could hear a noise coming from downstairs, and Mary heard it too, as she stopped putting burgers in my mouth. It was my wife who came home from her business trip. I started screaming, and at that moment, Mary started putting more food in my mouth. As my wife rushed upstairs, Mary got scared and ran towards the door. The two met outside my bedroom, and Mary pushed my wife out of the way, then ran towards the front door before escaping. Fortunately, I was okay after my wife untied me. We called the cops and gave them all of Mary's details, but to this day, the police hasn't been able to find her.
I glanced at the woman sitting by the table towards the back in McDonald's. She always came around this time, and then she would sit by herself for about 30 minutes before a man would come to join her. They would then speak in low tones. I guessed that they were lovers, but maybe they had been in a disagreement because every time the man left her, she would look visibly frightened. It just looked like a lover's spat, so no one really paid them any attention. She would then glance around the restaurant, trying to see if anyone was looking at her. I always pretended I never noticed. She ordered the same thing, 1 iced mocha and a hamburger. It was a Friday night. She had been here for a while now. It had been 2 hours, and her lover was nowhere to be found. She was continually glancing at her wristwatch. He never used to take this long. I wondered why he was so late. It was a few minutes to closing time, and all the other customers were ready to leave. In fact, just 2 tables were occupied. A couple sat at one, whispering affectionately to each other, and this lady occupied the second one. I didn't know her name. I always referred to her as the sad lady because she always looked so sad. I had never seen her smile. She was beautiful, with pale blonde hair tumbling down her shoulders to her mid-back and blue eyes that always looked troubled. The other couple left, the man opening the door for the lady as they both laughed together. Steve, my boss, came in from his office and glanced around the restaurant. "Only her?" I nodded and told him that I had to clean the counter before I left and that if the lady was still there, I would ask her to leave. Steve told me to hurry because all the other employees had gone home and it was late. I told him I would be fine. After I was done cleaning and saw that the sad lady was still there, I sighed and made my way over to her. "Hello, I'm about to close the building. You have to leave." She looked at me with her big blue eyes and nodded. She stood up, grabbing her purse from the table. She stumbled as she pushed her chair back and my hands shot out to steady her. We both heard the door open and looked back. It was the man I assumed to be her lover. Her body began to tremble, and that was when I realized my hands were still on her waist. I abruptly dropped my hands and backed away. The man looked at her first, then slowly returned his gaze to me. He approached quietly with rage in his bloodshot eyes. He had sandy brown hair and looked to be above 6 feet. I wanted to be as far away from them as possible because the guy stared as if he was capable of murder. He glared at the sad lady. "Grace, so I don't show up one night and eventually you leave me for another man?" he said. The lady stammered and tried to explain that it was a misunderstanding, but the man would not listen. Instead, it seemed like his rage was worsening. I steadily moved towards the counter where my phone was because the situation looked like it was going to get violent. He suddenly grabbed her hand and she yelled in pain, saying, "Charles, you are hurting me." "So?" he told her. "Do you know how it felt like to see another man's hands on you? You're mine." I was the other man. I swallowed hard because it seemed like I was in big trouble. I lunged for my phone and opened the dialer. He suddenly shouted at me and asked what I was doing with my phone. He told me if I was thinking of calling the police, that I should stop. If not, he would hurt me. He was really big. He had big muscles and a towering figure. He was very intimidating. I looked at Grace and saw that he still held her arm in a vice-like grip. She was whimpering in pain, but didn't put up a fight. I told him I wouldn't call the police if he let her go and just walked away quietly. He scoffed at me and told me I had no idea what I was talking about. He kept on saying, "Grace is mine. No one touches her but me." I was beginning to think that the man was a psychopath. I began to dial on my phone 911. As soon as I was about to hit the call button, my phone got wrenched away from my hands. I watched in horror as he threw it across the room and it shattered on the opposite wall. Apparently, in the 2 seconds I glanced down to type on my phone, he had released Grace and crossed over to me. He punched me on the side of my face and my head snapped to the other side. My vision swam and I clutched my head in pain. "I told you to not call the police. Do you think you are smart?" he shouted. A chair scraped on the floor and we both looked back to see Grace moving towards the exit. He roared and ran towards her. She wasn't fast enough. He pulled her back by her hair and slapped her face hard. Her lip split and got bloody. My hands were still on my swollen face from the punch he gave me. It began to dawn on me slowly that Charles was an animal that would hurt us if we tried to escape. My survival instincts took over. I grabbed a frying pan under the cabinet and crept towards him. His back was to me, and he kept shaking Grace by her hair. Grace saw me approaching with the frying pan and bit his arm to distract him. He yelled and raised a meaty palm, probably to slap her again. I swung the pan with all my strength and was satisfied to hear a cracking sound. He dropped to the floor, groaning. I reached around him and grabbed Grace's hand, ignoring the pain from my face. "Come on, there's a back door," I said. "No, Grace, don't leave me." He started to sob. I looked back at him in disgust and led Grace outside through the back door. As soon as we got outside, Grace gulped down air and pushed her hair back from her face. Her face was wet with tears. I said nothing and I led her to a safe distance from the restaurant. I was wondering how we would call the police when I saw that Grace was clutching her purse. "Please tell me you have a phone there," I pleaded. She gave me her phone and I called 911 and informed them of our situation. I gave them our location and they promised to be there in about 10 minutes. After the call, Grace looked at me with her blue eyes shining with tears. "Thank you so much," she choked out. I never thought I would be free. I asked her how she got herself involved with him. She told me that he had been stalking her for a long time. He later approached her and asked her out. Grace said she turned him down because he looked like a weirdo and she did not even know him. After the encounter, he had called to tell her that he knew where her mother lived and he wouldn't hesitate to hurt her if she did not do as he asked. He told her that if she got the police involved, he would know and her mother would die before he got captured. I had no choice. I couldn't let him kill my mom. She's the only family I have left. She said he forced her to go out with him, and it was always at McDonald's. She said he had lucid dreams where it felt like he was a normal person, but just like flipping a switch, he would revert back to being a threatening beast. The police arrived and came to us. They drove us back to McDonald's to arrest Charles. I narrated the whole ordeal on the way. We opened the door and saw that he was nowhere to be found. He had escaped. I should have locked the doors. I was too focused on getting us to safety. There was some blood on the floor with some kind of writing. Grace paled as she read it. Your mother dies today, and I'll come for you. Grace collapsed to the floor and began to weep uncontrollably. The police assured her that they would catch him no matter what. They went round the restaurant trying to get his prints. When they were done, they took us both to the hospital and we got treated. The next day, the news of a dead woman was everywhere. She had been killed in a violent manner, as if the killer had been too enraged to kill her cleanly. Her bones were broken, and across her stomach were the words, I'm coming for you. I never saw Grace in McDonald's anymore, but I knew of a certainty that as long as Charles was still out there, Grace would always be looking over her shoulder. She would never know peace.